Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Fractured Faith podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hopping. Today, we are talking about the mystery that refused to be simplified. That is right. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? I'm recording this kind of post-Easter for most Protestants and Catholics. Granted, Easter or Resurrection Sunday is coming up for our Eastern Orthodox family members on this coming weekend. So kind of in the middle of a post-Holy Week, kind of inward Holy Week kind of deal. Anyway, great time to be talking a little bit more about who was Jesus of Nazareth. That's definitely a good question. Now, before I get started on there, just a little housekeeping for those of you who are new. Just to introduce myself. You know my name, Joshua Hopping. I am a lay theologian with a master's degree in theology and culture from St. Stephen's University. I'm an ordained pastor, church planner, and author. I've written three books, two in the theology spiritual world and one in business. I'm a nerd. I am a nerd. I am deep in this thing. And the one thing I love sharing with you guys is how we can look at the mosaic of belief and the different things that are coming down and how can we hold this together. That's kind of where I talk about being a Christian mystic. Check out an earlier episode on that one. And that really where it comes into play on this particular one, because a lot of time when we talk about who is Jesus, or we talk about Jesus on the Holy Week and Resurrection Sunday, we tend to reduce the mystery of Jesus, and we tend to reduce it down into very simplistic areas, or we try to emphasize one element of the mystery over and above the other. And that can be dangerous, and that could be kind of challenging. And like I said, there's danger in breaking that tension. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about the different ways that the early church wrestled with this understanding of who Jesus was. There is almost kind of this misconception that the apostles and the early church started with theology, they started with doctrine, and then they kind of built and controlled things. But that's not true. In fact, what happened is they started with this mystical event that just blew everything away, and they did not know what to do with it. Okay, they did not know what to do. I cannot overemphasize this enough. The early church, the apostles, Paul, Luke, John, James, all the authors of the New Testament, Jude, they were met with this mystical experience in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, from his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, that these insane mystical events that they could not explain, but they felt them and they told people about them. And when they told people about them, lives began to be changed. Things started happening that they did not expect. And then as that happened, and as people said, hey, we want to follow this person, Jesus, we want to be members of the way, and be called Christians or little Christ, little Messiahs, little Jesuses, then they kind of had to figure out, well, what is it that we believe? Like, what's going on, right? And then for hundreds of years and hundreds, like 600 years or more, they wrestled with this understanding of what happened on that Easter. What happened at that time when Jesus come? And they tried to do this. They a lot of times it was very clumsily. They got it wrong. They got it right. There was wrestling. There was a lot of people and a lot of feelings. Some people resorted to violence in some cases. I mean, it really was insane. But all was wrestling into who was Jesus. So and that's a struggle I think we even have today, right now in our modern times, is who is Jesus? Who gets to decide who Jesus? And I see memes and posts all the times about, well, Jesus is love, or Jesus was this. Jesus went down to church, Constantine wanted power, and they went there and all this thing, and we try to define and break it down, and then we pick sometimes our own kind of historical realities. Almost we kind of project it backwards on the church in history to be able to say what's happening. And that's where we really kind of have to start from where they were at, right? What was happening at that time. And in that one, we really have to stop it again. It's the reality that as the first century Jewish people, the Jewish people were strictly monotheism. They had experienced hundreds of years of oppression Actually, originally by Alexander the Great. Well, even before then, you got the development of the Old Testament. You have I'm kind of skipping past the Old Testament where you had Babylon and Egypt and everything else. But as they developed on they went through history and they developed their faith after the end of Micah, basically, in the silence, 400-year silence between Micah and Matthew, which, if you read the Maccabees in the intertestament period, God wasn't silent. It's a little pet peeve. And it tells us, but yeah, Alexander the Great come in and they came over, and then the descendants of Alexander the Great, the Greeks, and they tried to actually force the Jewish people to give up their kosher meals and to give up their Sabbath day and give up their religion. And they fought back and they fought and then they died and they pressed and they said, no, we're going to stay true. And they gained independence and they were independent for about 100 years. And then the Rome came in and then Rome was kind of pulling in there. And in that, again, they were strictly monotheism. So when you talk about the disciples, especially Paul, who's a very explicitly a Pharisee, right? A very, very trained theologian in the Pharisee camp. But even outside of him, with John and James and these various people, the zealots, these were people who were part of the Jewish faith, and they all believed in the strict monotheism. Monotheism means one God, right? It is the God of the Old Testament, the creator of heaven and earth. That was what was happening. And they had certain ways to be able to worship that, certain ideals and understandings of what was going on. And then they meet this Jesus dude, and Jesus shows up and he says, follow me. Something in there just broke down. They left their nets, they left their homes, their jobs, and they said, we're going to follow this guy. And something happened. They see these signs and wonders and miracles and people coming back to life, and Lazarus, and then we had the sick and being healed, and the lame walking, and all the different things. There's like a 2 or 3 year period there. We're not 100% sure. We think it's about 3 years that stuff started going down, and the disciples are just blown away. Then you had the death of Jesus, the crucifixion. And then you have the resurrection, and the body was gone, and what was to do with that? And then it showed up and it appeared to them behind locked doors, and there's this mystical thing going, like something happened, and they had to speak out about that, right? And they had to speak out. And I know N.T. Wright has a great information about, what would it take for a first century Jew to be able to claim the resurrection and to be able to even worship Jesus as God, as it started happening in the early church. And that was powerful. And that's why, actually, to be honest, that's one of the reasons I actually think that Christianity actually has a grain of truth, because the New Testament, the Gospels, presents a story that is like anything else. Like, there is a lot of stuff in it. And for a first century Jewish person and authors to do what they do and to say what they say is mind-boggling. It really is just mind-boggling. This is why I will encourage you to go read 1st and 2nd and 3rd Maccabees, because you'll see how much the Jewish people fought against the acculturation and the kind of the ideals of what's happening there. So when Jesus shows up to the story and you see what happened and how he changed hearts, it really helps you to understand the Maccabees and what was happening there, and understanding how radical that really was, right? And I got to go on a whole lecture about that. But with this, though, there's this mystery, this mystical event that comes in. And in that is their attention. How does a faithful Jew say that Jesus is Lord without abandoning the God of Israel? Okay, that's not the thought. That's survival. It means, how do you say that Jesus is Lord without abandoning the God of your people? And they don't have categories for this. There's everything that comes in there they're wrestling with. And as we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about what's been called heresies, capital kind of heresies, and the churches kind of say, hey, these are wrong. Now, these people weren't setting out to be heretics. They were trying to understand this mystery. And again, the church got it right and they got it wrong. We have people wrestling with this stuff, right? It's just like we wrestle with things today. And over hundreds of years of wrestling with things, we got to understand a little bit more about who Jesus was. Okay. And we at this point, I guess I should mention that we know that Jesus Nazareth was an historical person. There's enough historical evidence in the Bible and outside the Bible that we know there was a individual named Jesus at that time that did die. Now, who he was, again, that's what we're going to talk about. So the first movement you have is Marcion. Marcion, he lives about 85 to 160 AD. So this is about, he's about 100 years after Jesus or whatnot. And one of the things he was looking at is like, man, the God of Israel, the God of the Old Testament does not look like Jesus at all. Okay. That by his time, the New Testament's kind of been written. The letters going, we don't have the canon yet. Don't get me wrong. The canon's not there. The letters of the New Testament, the Gospels, Paul's letters, they're being floated around. The Shepherd Music is being floated around. There's a bunch of other letters being floated around. They don't have anything locked in place yet. The only thing that really is we have what we call the Old Testament with the Hebrew scriptures, and they had the intertestament period of the Maccabees left, and that's their writing. And when they read those, and then they look at Jesus and the teachings of the apostles and elders and things, Marcion's like, they're two different people. They must be two different gods. There must be. And in doing this, he rejected the entire Hebrew Old Testament entirely. And then he looked at Luke and Paul's letters, and he kind of edited a little bit to say, yeah, I'm not sure if that is. We're going to make two different deals here. And he actually was the first person to come up with a canon, which is basically, canon is this bound library of saying that these are the letters or the understandings of the faith that we're going to build a foundation or really kind of help us more understand what's happening. And that was one that which it was a tension, right? It broke that tension of Jesus being connected to the Old Testament, New Testament, Jesus being connected to the Hebrew people. And so the early church fathers in the 2nd century, they had said, you know what, whoa, wait a minute. We can't have Jesus showing up just out there. This is not two different gods. That Jesus is a Jew, and Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ as prophesied by Isaiah. He has a connection back to Moses. We can't just separate this and take Jesus out and go, right? Because again, well, just so you know, most of the time, 2nd century, you have a lot of people who are Gentiles or non-Jewish people in the faith, and you still have a lot of Jewish heritage people in the faith as well. It's kind of mixed in that 2nd century. And they're like, we have to keep this together. So they look at that tension and they say, no, we must hold on to tension. The God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, they're the same God. Now, there's a lot of craziness in there, but we have to figure that out. We're not going to break that tension. We're going to live in that mystery that we have one God, and the God of Jesus, the God of Jesus and the God of the Old Testament, they're one and the same. So that was the first kind of big thing looking at. Now, around that same time, in that 1st to 3rd century, again, this is about 200-300 years of wrestling, we had the question of, if Jesus is God, was he really human? Because that was really the big thing with them at the point is the Hebrew people, the 1st century mindset, they could understand about Jesus being God. That was less of an issue, and we'll get to that a little bit later because there's other things there. But they're also wrestling with, well, is he human? Is he really human in doing this? If you think about the Greek and Roman theologies or stories, you have Zeus and you have who come down, and he would have Zeus, Jupiter, be kind of the head god of the pantheon of the gods and goddesses of the Greek and the Romans. Well, Jupiter and Romans and Zeus and Greek. And this is where we actually named the planet Jupiter is named after that god, right? And you have, even today, you have a lot of different stories about Zeus coming in places in Marvel and in other different books and stuff and movies and TV. He's very popular, right? But Zeus had the appearance of being a human, and he would appear as a human to basically have sexual relationship with other animals and other people in the area, but he was never really human. He was just the appearance of that. So with that mindset, there you had this Gnosticism and Gnosticism. Those are kind of the fancy words for these ideals. And really was understanding that matter, physical matter, flesh and blood, was inferior and corrupt. and that Jesus being holy and being, really God, that he could not have physical matter. He cannot be incarnate and actually in flesh, because that would be a holy God, a pure, amazing being cannot actually take on matter, because matter, flesh and blood, was inherently bad. So Jesus only appeared to be human. Okay, he didn't really do it. Now that that desire was really coming out of the ideal to protect divine purity, to avoid the scandals of a suffering God. And I would say there's actually people today that we want to emphasize the divinity of Jesus and the justice of God, because we want to protect that divine purity and avoid that scandaling. We don't want God to die, right? To die on the cross. We don't want that. So we want the appearance of human. Now, if Jesus was not truly human, then there really was no real suffering, and he had no real death. And if there's no suffering, that he really didn't actually understand what it was to be human, then there's no real healing of humanity. And you need to think about Hebrews. Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, and the Bible talks about how we have a high priest that knows what it's like to be able to suffer and to understand us in all ways. And that really doesn't make sense if Jesus only appeared to be human. If he really was this divine being appeared, it doesn't. But really, we have to actually engage this understanding that matter, physicality, is not inherently corrupt. And this is one of the problems I have with some of the Reformed theology about total depravity, because it actually means that all matter, and total depravity and Reform, they're not Gnosticism, they're borderline Gnostics, I think, in a lot of ways, I would say, but they would say not, because they try to define it and get around it. But I think borderline in the sense that a lot of it's easy to go away. If you think all of matter and all of physicality, everything's corrupted and horrible and nothing good in it, then it's easy to kind of fall into that Gnosis thing of, well, it's all corrupted. There really is nothing there. But the church, in responding to this, really wanted to say, no, Jesus is God, and he has to be really human. So be able to understand and really know what it is to be able to heal everything in us as humanity. He has to be human to be able to heal us and to bring that salvation. Now, we also had another one, Apollinarianism. How's that for a word? This is about 4th century. That's getting up at 300. So it's about, a couple hundred years, again, 300 years or so after Jesus. And the idea was that Jesus had a human body, but his mind was divine. So Jesus was human on the outside. You could touch him, feel him, but he had a divine mind. His mind was somehow not there. So the logos got replaced the human soul. And it's appealing because it keeps the unity of Christ. It kind of keeps everything packaged together, and it kind of avoids kind of a split personality. However, if the mind is not fully human, and Christ lacks that human mind, then human minds remain unredeemed. In order for us to redeem everything, and in fact, there's a great quote from one of the Nicene fathers. It says, "What is not assumed is not healed." In other words, Jesus had to assume the human body and the human mind in order to be able to heal the human body and the human mind. And so, again, we have to have this divine mystery of his tension of saying that, yeah, Jesus is fully God, and he actually is fully human as well. He's fully human in all of his areas that came into it, to a point that, that's where it has to. So the Council of Constantinople, for example, in 381, it really kind of starts kind of condemning some of the stuff and saying, we got to keep this tension. We got to keep the mystery together of Jesus being God and human, and he's not just the appearance or just the mind. It's all the above, has to be it to it, right? So that was a wrestling of that one. Now, the other wrestling at that same kind of happening around the same time, because again, a lot of people are trying to figure this out. In the first 300 years is like insane trying to make sense of this mystical event that just hit us, right, the people. And this one says, if Jesus is human, was he really God? So again, the other question was, if Jesus was God, was he human? This is the other way around to say, well, okay, we accept the fact that he's human, But is he really God? And I think you actually see people even to this day saying, no, Jesus actually was a fully human guy. He wasn't God. Paul made him God. The early church made him God. The followers later on made him, but Jesus really was just a human guy. I think one guy says he was crushed on the wheels of history. He's like, as in he was just human. He was just this human teacher, and he got kind of just killed, right, and crushed, and he really wasn't God. Now, in the first couple hundred years, they had this Ebenism and adoptionism kind of ideal. And the ideal of this one is that Jesus was a righteous human being that was chosen by God. And this concept protects the strict monotheism of the Jews. It keeps it really, there's only one God. You don't have to wrestle with this Trinitarian deals or whatever else. It kind of resists that. It says, nope, there's God. Jesus is just a righteous, good human that was chosen. He's not a prophet. He's a prophet that's in there. That's all he is. He's a prophet. Okay? He's not really God. He's just a good prophet. And actually, a lot of Islam will actually say that. Islam will say that Jesus was just a human prophet. And it keeps Jesus understandable. Now, this breaks down, and the early church rejected this as a understanding because it says, you know what, if he's just human, then salvation becomes imitation and not participatory. God is not really present in Christ, and it really is this ideal that humanity somehow was able to do everything themselves, and it really kind of breaks that down, and we are imitating this. God's not participating in really in us, right? Again, there's nothing assumption of that. And it really kind of breaks down the divinity part of God helping it, which doesn't make sense of what Jesus claiming to be, where he did claim, hey, you see the Father, you see me, and you see it, participating in the divine incarnation coming in. And then from that, you had Arianism in the early 4th century that says, there's a time when Jesus maybe he wasn't a human, but he was created. So the fact that Jesus we use the word son, and that's what's used a lot in the New Testament to try to explain this relationship between God the Father, God the Son, which is kind of unfortunate. It kind of creates its own problem because it carries the ideal that the Son, Jesus, was created at some point, and that was Arianism. It was a big thing. Arianism almost became the big one, quite frankly. Arianism was really big. And it was ideal that Jesus was created. He's not internal. God created him. Jesus was like the first created being that came into it. And then he came to earth and he became human and then went, right? So, and it's okay, this preserves the hierarchy between God the Father and God the Son. It makes a logical sense of the divine equalness. However, again, this is a reduction of the mystery that you have of Jesus of Nazareth, it's a reduction of what happened in that resurrection event and all the ministry of Jesus. Because if Christ is not fully God, then he cannot unite humanity to God. And now worship becomes misplaced. You don't worship Jesus. And why do I want to be a little Jesus follower or replace it? Because Jesus, if he's created, then he's not the divine. So why do I even want to even talk to Jesus? I want to talk to the divine, right? And if he's this created being that was somehow created, then how can he actually unite humanity to God when he's just another created being? He's like an angel or just something of that nature created, right? And so it starts breaking down and that tension falls apart. And again, for a couple hundred years, they were wrestling with this because they're like, well, if this is that, then what about this? So when you have the Council of Nicaea in 325, which was the one that the big one everybody talks about, they were really coming against Arianism. And it really was trying to make sense of, wait a minute, if Jesus is human, was he really God? And what is that? And that's where in the Council of Nicaea, you had the creed that says he was begotten, not made. Begotten means this ideal that he was, but he wasn't made. He's the same essence with the Father, and trying to understand that. And I think that's a tension. And again, these two movements, right? Is he God? Then how can he be human? If he's human, how can he be God? And the early church is, again, not trying to be authoritarian and trying to control. They're trying to maintain the mystery behind that and trying to make sure that we don't reduce this mystical tension of what's going on. Because, again, if he's just human and not God, then God's not participating in us. And how can he actually human redeem us? If he's just God and he appears as human, then we're not fully healed or redeemed because he has to assume all that we. And how can I go to him who has to know what it is like to experience death or pain or hurt or child or all those different things? So you have to really kind of see this ideal of tension of, yeah, he's God and yeah, he's human. And that really was that the debate. And it wasn't settled. I mean, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. This is where I kind of come to. This was a lot of people over hundreds of years. And even though the Council of Nicaea in 325 came made a stance, they were still wrestling with Arianism and different ideals and Gnosticism for a while. In fact, we still have people today, there's church groups today, I'm getting ahead of myself, that are actually still in the kind of this Arianism ideal that Christ was somehow created and wasn't fully God, or that Christ was a God, but he wasn't really human. Again, there's nothing really new under the sun, right? Now, also, there's another movement at place, right? Again, all these people are trying to wrestle with this mystical experience as they're coming and preaching and hearing about Jesus the first time. They're having their own the road to Damascus experience, and they are also having experiences and mystical things and saying, and they're trying to explain what they're feeling and what they're seeing just as much as they're trying to understand what happened to the apostles. And the fourth movement is trying to simplify the Trinity. Modalism and Sabellianism, that's another name for you, in the 3rd century. And in this ideal, they're trying to figure out the Holy Spirit. Because we hear about the Spirit in the Gospels and in Paul, and they're like, what's going on with that? Then we got this God the Father, we got Jesus, what's happening? And so they're trying to protect the monotheism of one God. They're trying to avoid the complexity of things. And so they said, hey, you know what? Modalism said, you know what? I want to have one God who appears in different mode. So he appears as the Father, then he appears as the Son, then he appears as the Spirit. And so the 3 different ways of appearing. So it is like Joshua hopping, having the role of a father, and then I go to my office and I have the role of being a private investigator, which is what I do in fraud investigations, which is what I do for a career. Theology podcasting doesn't actually pay the bills. And then maybe I hear Joshua the theologian, right? So I have 3. I got Joshua the fraud prevention guy, Joshua the theologian, Joshua the husband and father. And so I have 3 different modes, 3 different deals, but it's the same person. So God is Father, Son, and Spirit, and it's just changing hats. Now, while that avoids the complexity, it does remove the real relationship within God himself, and it undermines love. It's his internal deals, and it became this shifting of roles going, and really kind of breaks some of that tension that you see within the scriptures and the experiences they had of that. And so that's where in Nicaea, Council of Nicaea 325, Constantinople in 381, you see through the debates of the 3rd century. This is why you get Nicene and Constantinople debate, creeds. You have this preserving of the Trinitarian view of God the Father is the Spirit, is the Father, but is not the, but is. There is, but there isn't. So it's 3 persons in one. And trying to unpack that. And that's a lot of that Greek philosophy coming in there. I do admit that coming into it. But really trying to preserve this mystery and this understanding that there's something happening here that doesn't make logical sense. And yet we need to preserve the complexity. Again, maybe this is my mystical side of me coming out, but honestly, I kind of like that. And I actually like the Trinity because as you read these debates, understanding what they're trying to do and why they're trying to preserve this mystery, it makes a lot of sense. And also understanding that if it was a human creation, if this religion, if Christianity was just made by humanity, you would break that. You would stop the Trinity. The Trinity doesn't make sense. Like, how can you claim to be one God in 3 persons? That doesn't make sense. But I think it is the mystery of not making sense that actually makes more sense, because it's, again, their experiences and ideals are coming in. They're like, whoa, we have to preserve this. In fact, there's the other deal of it's 4th century. I'm going to butcher this name, but it's a Pumater. I can't even spell it. There's another heresy, a big old lame of it. But basically saying that the Holy Spirit's not fully divine. And again, it breaks that tension of is the fullness of God's presence of the Spirit becoming a lesser force rather than really participating in it. And so at the 381 Council of Concilio, to be able to say, okay, we actually going to land in this ideal of we have a Trinitarian God, one God, three persons, God the Father, God the Spirit, God the Son. And these are all intertwined, and to see one and to see the other, yet they're not all the same, yet they are. And that's a mystery. That's an understanding. There's a tension in play that we must continue. And we in reducing that breaks the tension and affects our salvation, affects how we understand things in so many ways, which is why the church took hundreds of years to debate this. This is not something that came out lightly, guys. I cannot do this. We live in a world of TikToks in 5 minutes. This was hundreds of years 400 years of wrestling with this one, and it continues to be wrestled with since then, trying to understand and make sense of what happened and how that relates. And all we have documents, and we have all these documents. You go read them and look at them. We have a lot of this stuff, understanding, unpacking this, and there's reasons in that tension. Now, this comes where things are kind of shifting a little bit. This is kind of the starting of the 5th century. We kind of established at that point that, hey, Jesus is fully man and fully human. But now, how does God and humanity meet in Jesus? So this is getting a little bit more nuanced, okay? This is getting a little more fragile, but you have Nestorianism. It's ideal that you have two persons, one's divine and one's human, living in Jesus. So it protects those divinity and the human side of things, but it also divides Christ, because Christ now is actually two different things, right? He's two people living in one. And the incarnation is a partnership, not a union. And so that breaks down, and again, about Council of Ephesus in 431, that's about another 50 or 60 years after Constantinople. Oh, they're wrestling with this one, like, yeah, we don't think so. But here again, we actually do have some of the Nestorian churches because they're actually still existing today, and they're wrestling with a lot of this, and they still come into it. Now, then you have like monotheism, which is like fifth century, and it really is to say, okay, Jesus has one nature after human. The human absorbs into the divine. So that protects the unity of Christ. They still can say he's human and divine, but the human nature disappears. And again, that breaks down that mystery, and then the incarnation becomes an illusion again, because now you really don't have a full human. You have a human that appears to be human, because the human becomes the divine, it disappears. And that they wrestle like, no, I don't think that's it either, right? We got to get the tension that God is fully human, Jesus is fully God and fully human, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. Okay? Again, these councils are not trying to explain the mystery. They're not trying to force people into an understanding of the mystery. They're trying to maintain boundaries to say, let's not break the tension of the mystery. It would have been easier to break the mystery. It would have been easier just to go one way or another, but it's harder to keep that tension, and that's what they're trying to do. So a lot of these different heresies are trying to resolve that tension, and the church is saying, let's hang on to it. Not because we enjoy the paradox, but because the encounter itself demands it. If Jesus is not fully God, then there's no true union with God. If Jesus is not fully human, then there's no true healing of humanity. So we have to maintain that unity and understanding that Jesus is fully in his mind, in his will, in his body. All that has been assumed into it, so that when I look at as a human, I know that I've had my God, my Jesus has actually been able to experience everything I experience, being able to understand that, having the same mind, understand the human mind, or a human will, all that stuff is going around. He's had a different body. He went poop, he peed. He experienced all the things that I experience as a human male. And yet he stayed close to God, and he walked through it, which actually, again, kind of makes us redefine what sin is, and that's a different story, but that's where we come into it. So these modern echoes, right? So we say Jesus is just a good teacher. That's a doctrine. God would never suffer. That's Gnosticism. That there's no distinction between the Father, Son, and Spirit. Modalism. Spiritual Jesus, not embodied, is Gnostic tendency. I've heard it say that that we are human, we are spiritual beings in a physical body that have a soul, and it's like no. Again, we're getting that Gnostic tendency because we're denying that, right? These are all modern echoes of these same debates, right? Or Jesus is less than God. There it is, some echoes. All these are ways of breaking the tension of the mystery of understanding Jesus is, and we have to continue to just hold that tension. And again, I think most people are not deliberately choosing these heresies, or not. They're rather than inheriting fragments without knowing the story. They don't know. A lot of our churches and things, it's in our pastors and even some of our church movement and stuff. It's easy. They want to help people. They want to know and be a part of it, and so they break that tension even without knowing. Individuals right now, we live in a world in America today. This is 2026 in the United States. We have a lot of people that individualism rules, and so we have a lot of these people. Individuals are choosing these different things without knowing the full history behind what's going on, or how that affects their salvation, or how that affects how they live their life, when it really does. And so we have to refuse to collapse the mystery. We have to be able to hold it down. And as we come to end here, realizing that, you know what, the early Christians were not trying to explain Jesus. They're trying to stay faithful to what they encountered in this one. And in the run, they did things that didn't hold up. They pushed too far one way and they came back to they tried to resolve something that couldn't be resolved. And again, slowly the church pushed back the other way, and they had debates back and forth. And sometimes the way of the church went this way, and sometimes it went that way. If you read church history, you see this movement of all these things coming in there. But at the end, we chose to come back. Our elders, our people gone before us, our ancestors, they held on to the mystery that in Jesus, God truly came near. Humanity has truly been taken up without either one being lost. And we have to continue to have that, and not to fall into the temptation to break that tension, to say this or that, right? We need to let the mystery stand. The moment we collapse that tension, we lose something essential. It's not just a doctrine we lose. We lose something essential in who we are and what happened in the mystery of the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, and all that happened in his life, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension. We have to hold the attention that he's fully God, fully human. We have the Spirit, the Son, the Father, in this mysterious union that comes in there that defies our human understanding, and yet is so close, but yet so far away. It is, as I think, the mystery of the faith is looking into the brightness of the sun. It is so bright that we are blinded by the beauty of what happens. And we keep this tension, because to lose the tension is to lose the incarnation. And to lose the incarnation is to lose the hope that God has truly came near to us. All right? So hopefully, thank you guys for listening. Hopefully you guys made it all the way through it. I know a lot of different things happening. Try to kind of pull it together and understand. There's a lot more to be said about all these. Lots of resources out there to come into it, but just hold the tension of coming in. Some of this, if you want additional resources, some of my other books kind of, well, they don't go into the heresy so much, but we talk about that tension, the here and not yet, what is kingdom theology and what it matters. Does a really good job of that one, as well as the mystery of the way and the journey. And there's other great resources, but the main point is to hold the mystery together, because we had a mystical experience in the person of Jesus. And we as a church, we as a faith, has been hundreds of years wrestling through this. And if we break that tension, there are consequences that deal with it. And again, we have to keep the tension. It's about balance, harmony, bring it together, living in attention. And I'm going to go off if I don't end it. So thank you guys. Thank you so much again for joining me on this episode of Fractured Faith. Make sure you like the YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, share it around to people, make comments. Let me know if you got any other topics you want to talk about. I know I have one coming up, probably next one, either next or that one after. I want to talk a little bit about The Cherokees in the faith, I hear a lot of people saying that, well, Native American religions and specifically Cherokee religion is demonic. So I want to kind of unpack that a little bit because I definitely don't think that one. And I want to be able to kind of pull from some of my experience and stuff as well, going to stomps and understanding what it is on that one. So we're going to be kind of diving into that a little bit. I also want to talk a little bit about leadership and authority in the church at some point. So we have some good things coming in this season of the Fractured Faith podcast. So like it, subscribe, make sure you don't miss the episode, and I will talk to you all later. So, until we see again. Goodbye.